Thomas Jefferson's principles came to him over time out of his readings of the great minds of past generations, his correspondence with leading contemporary thinkers, and his own moral sense of right and wrong. As his activities and reputation expanded, so did interest in what he had to say on the important moral and philosophical issues relating to property and privilege. In 1760, at the age of 17, Jefferson left home to attend William and Mary College at Williamsburg, the colonial capital. Here, Jefferson came under the influence of two professors of extraordinary intellect, George Wythe, the foremost legal mind in Virginia, and William Small, the professor of mathematics and moral philosophy. After graduating in 1762, Jefferson spent the next 5 years studying the law under George Wythe. He was elected to the House of Burgesses in 1769, where his first action was submission of an unsuccessful bill allowing owners of slaves to grant persons held in bondage freedom. He later wrote, "I made one effort in that body for the permission of the emancipation of slaves, which was rejected, and indeed during the regal government nothing liberal could expect success." 5 years later, he denounced slavery as, quote, "an infamous practice," unquote. Yet he continued to hold hundreds of people of color in bondage as his property, prohibited by law, economic necessity, and his own narrow view of their potential to live in an environment of self-governance from extending to them the liberty he enjoyed. As colonial resistance to British authority increased during the early 1770s, Jefferson joined with other, generally young, Virginia citizens such as Patrick Henry to protest the Intolerable Acts and other measures indicative of escalating British tyranny over the colonials. He soon authored a set of resolutions under the title, "A Summary View of the Rights of British America." Deemed too radical, the Virginia Convention rejected them, but the document was printed and widely circulated. Among the rights claimed by the colonials was the right to enter into commerce with whomsoever they pleased. Jefferson declared that the exercise of a free trade with all parts of the world, possessed by the American colonists as of natural right, and which no law of their own had taken away or abridged, was next the object of unjust encroachment. To Jefferson, the liberty to engage in commerce with others was fundamental. Some years later, in 1785, he wrote to the Count de Vergennes that "The monopoly of the purchase of tobacco in France discourages both the French and American merchant from bringing it to France. It is contrary to the spirit of trade and to the dispositions of merchants to carry a commodity to any market where but one person is allowed to buy it and where, of course, that person fixes its price." Another of Jefferson's legal acts was to protest the application of British laws regarding land ownership. He states the case as follows. "Our Saxon ancestors held their lands, as they did their personal property, in absolute dominion, disencumbered with any superior, answering nearly to the nature of those possessions which the feudalists term allodial. Our ancestors, however, who migrated hither were farmers, not lawyers." Allodial ownership to Jefferson meant control of land without feudal obligations to the monarch. The fictitious principle that all lands belong originally to the king, they were early persuaded to believe real, and accordingly took grants of their own lands from the crown. And while the crown continued to grant for small sums and on reasonable rents, there was no inducement to arrest the heir and lay it open to public view. The fundamental issue Jefferson raised was whether, as claimed, Britain's laws applied only to colonial landowners. In the spirit of equal and impartial legislation is to be viewed the Act of Parliament, by which American lands are made subject to the demands of British creditors, while their own lands were still continued unanswerable for their debts, from which one of these conclusions must necessarily follow, either that justice is not the same thing in America as in Britain, or else that the British Parliament pay less regard to it here than there. The two forms of privilege entrenched in British law that Jefferson opposed were primogeniture and entails. Primogeniture, Latin for firstborn, required that all of a man's wealth be passed to his eldest son upon his death. Entails stipulated that this requirement applied to the land in perpetuity. Over time, this practice ensured the slow accumulation of great wealth by a few of the families who lived in Virginia the longest. These families formed what was called a patrician order by Jefferson. His own wealth would eventually be lost because of a combination of excessive personal spending, poor management of his farming estates, and numerous family problems. His reputation established in Virginia, Jefferson was selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, arriving in Philadelphia in June of 1775. The following year, he joined with Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and others to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's original draft underwent considerable editing after consultation with Franklin and Adams. This final language came from their collaborative effort. This was certainly a radical and liberal expression of the rights of individuals. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. At the next session of the Virginia legislature, Jefferson drafted laws approved by the legislature abolishing the old world privileges of primogeniture and entails. In a letter to John Adams written in 1813, Jefferson recalled his feelings. These laws, drawn by myself, laid the axe to the root of pseudo-aristocracy. An important philosophical position argued over during Jefferson's life concerned the existence of natural rights. James Truslow Adams, a Jefferson biographer, concludes that one of the not least interesting features of Jefferson's theory as to the distinction between natural and civil rights was that it ruled economics out of the field of natural law, and property could be maintained only by the help of society, and it was therefore a civil right only. This seems to account for the use of the phrase in the Declaration of Independence, pursuit of happiness, rather than the pursuit of property. In his 1775 Declaration on Taking Up Arms, Jefferson observed, "The political institutions of America, its various soils and climates, opened a certain resource to the unfortunate and to the enterprising of every country, and ensured to them the acquisition and free possession of property." On the question of how long the free access to the means of self-sufficiency would last, Jefferson expressed only optimism because of the enormity of the North American continent. As the war for independence continued, A great concern for the colonial subjects of Britain now in rebellion was how to pay for the expenses of the new military. Depreciation of American paper currency cost Jefferson a good deal of the value of his personal assets during the war. This only hardened his opposition to paper currency and fractional reserve banking. Elected governor of Virginia in June of 1779, succeeding Patrick Henry, Jefferson found the Virginia treasury nearly empty. The state was short of everything needed to support the war effort, and the continental currency had become nearly worthless, in part because the British were flooding the countryside with counterfeit currency. To raise funds, Jefferson hoped to sell state lands and raise taxes. However, a poor tobacco crop made these measures impractical. Land values were falling, and many Virginians were hard-pressed to find the money to meet basic needs. On a personal level, Jefferson's cattle and other stock were taken and his property at Elk Hill destroyed by Lord Cornwallis in 1781. The following year, Jefferson stepped down as governor and returned to Monticello, where along with trying to reorganize his farm, he commenced writing his notes on Virginia in response to a request for information by a French official. As he looked upon the unique circumstance of the American experience, Jefferson recognized change would be inevitable. He hoped that a commitment to principle would create a future very different from what the peoples of the Old World endured. As he wrote, "The political economists of Europe have established it as a principle that every state should endeavor to manufacture for itself, and this principle, like many others, we transfer to America without calculating the difference of circumstance which should often produce a difference of result. In Europe, the lands are either cultivated or locked up against the cultivator. Manufacture must therefore be resorted to, of necessity, not of choice, to support the surplus of their people. But we have an immensity of land courting the industry of the husbandman. Is it best, then, that all our citizens should be employed in its improvement, or that one half should be called off from that to exercise manufactures and handicrafts for the other? Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people." A nation of self-supporting freeholders of property citizens would keep government within its just limits. As he argued, the mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body. Once again, Jefferson was chosen to represent Virginians at the Continental Congress. He chaired a committee to establish a new currency and coinage for the nation. The problem was, as he knew, the people are as yet not recovered from the depredations of the war. These Americans were in difficult financial circumstances. They had little ability to absorb new taxes, or even the interest to service the federal and state debts. The one means of raising revenue quickly was the sale of public lands. At the same time, the states were called upon to relinquish their claims to the frontier and beyond. The Virginia delegates approved the agreement on the 1st of March, 1784. All things considered, Jefferson was optimistic about the future of the new nation. In 1786, he conveyed this optimism in a letter. "The Confederation is a wonderfully perfect instrument, considering the circumstances under which it was formed." Yet Jefferson identified 3 areas in need of alteration. First, rules for admission of new states to the Union. Second, the apportionment of the cost of the federal government based on population rather than the value of landed property, because of the difficulty in coming up with a proper valuation. And third, prohibiting the states from entering into treaties with foreign nations. The dollar, the name taken from the Spanish gold coins that circulated throughout the New World, became the new standard. Coinage of gold and silver content was approved, although there was precious little of either metal available. The first silver dollar coins were minted in 1795. In 1784, Jefferson was appointed by the Congress to the post of Minister to France, where he joined Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in negotiating treaties of commerce. He spent the next 5 years there. As for whether or not his thinking was influenced by the time he spent in the company of Europe's leading lights, James Truslow Adams concludes that he came back without a single major idea which he had not taken with him when he sailed from Boston. Adams was not quite accurate in this assessment. Jefferson's understanding of political economy had evolved. In 1790, he wrote to Thomas Randolph that, "In political economy, I think Smith's Wealth of Nations the best book extant." However, he added that, "There are some excellent books of theory written by Turgot and the economists of France." These were the physiocrats, whose writings were major influences on the thinking of both Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. Adam Smith had in fact dedicated the Wealth of Nations to his physiocratic colleagues, from whom he had learned much. Jefferson's life in America did not prepare him for what he saw in France. As he wrote to a family friend in 1785, "Of 20 millions of people supposed to be in France, I am of opinion there are 19 millions more wretched, more accursed in every circumstance of human existence than the most conspicuously wretched individual of the whole United States." By spending time in France, Jefferson quickly recognized the uniquely positive circumstances enjoyed by the general population in the United States. In 1785, he wrote to James Madison regarding France, "The property of this country is absolutely concentrated in a very few hands." He knew that an equal division of property was an impracticable solution to the problem of landlessness. Even for agriculture, fertility, rainfall, topography, and other factors give land widely varying productive values. Jefferson's answer was simple. Exempt all from taxation below a certain point, and to tax the higher portions or property exempt all from taxation below a certain point, and to tax the higher portions or property in geometrical progression as they rise. Jefferson firmly believed that access to land was key to a prosperous future in the United States. Throughout his entire adult life, his financial fortunes would be directly tied to what the land would produce. Only the broad ownership of land would control the rents charged by landowners. Public land might also be made available under lease to those who could not afford the price of purchase. That every man who cannot find employment, but who can find uncultivated land, shall be at liberty to cultivate it, paying a moderate rent. We have now lands enough to employ an infinite number of people in their cultivation. Cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. As long as they can find employment in this line, I would not convert them into mariners, artisans, or anything else. To James Madison 2 years later, he warned, "Our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they are chiefly agricultural, and this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, they will become corrupt, as in Europe." British merchants sought from Adams and Jefferson a commitment to honor debts Americans still owed from before the war. The United States also owed a huge amount to the French government. There were as yet no gold or silver mines in the new United States, which meant that these debts could only be repaid with revenue from exports and the sale of public lands. European investors were, if nothing else, very interested in the opportunity to profit by speculation in U.S. land. Responding to a Dutch businessman's inquiry, Jefferson advised, "With respect to the sale of our lands, that cannot begin till a considerable portion shall have been surveyed, before we shall be able to judge of the efficacy of our land office to sink our national debt." The orderly settlement of the land by yeoman farmers was undermined by the financial needs of government, as well as those who saw speculation in Western lands as a means of wealth accumulation. The new federal constitution simply ignored the complicated issue of how the public domain would be preserved and managed. Jefferson, who always feared the centralization of political power, communicated his thoughts on the new Constitution to John Adams. Indeed, I think all the good of this new Constitution might have been couched in 3 or 4 new articles, to be added to the good, old, and venerable fabric, which should have been preserved even as a religious relic. To James Madison, Jefferson expressed his most serious displeasure at the omission of a Bill of Rights and the failure to impose restrictions on monopolies. No sooner had Jefferson returned from France than George Washington nominated him to become Secretary of State. James Madison brought him up to date on all that had occurred during the Constitutional Convention and the growing split between the Federalists and those who defended the sovereignty of the states. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay did their best to put all of the issues before the new nation's leading civic leaders. Jefferson's differences with Hamilton were fundamental. In September of 1792, Jefferson wrote to President Washington expressing his deep concern over the measures taken by Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. His system flowed from principles adverse to liberty and was calculated to undermine and demolish the Republic by creating an influence of his department over the members of the legislature. As Jefferson had years before predicted, once independence was achieved, factions arose, and both class and special interests began to dominate public policy. In 1793, Jefferson provided his opinion on the question of whether the United States had the right to renounce their treaties with France. Note here that the reference to the United States is in the plural rather than as a single nation. This distinction is in the original statement. Jefferson took the opportunity to express his view that a society is formed by the voluntary association of individuals. The moral duties which exist between individual and individual in a state of nature accompany them into a state of society, and the aggregate of the duties of all the individuals composing the society constitutes the duties of that society towards any other. Civil rights, including the right to vote for one's representatives, Jefferson saw as a privilege to be earned. To John Adams, he admitted as much. I agree with you that there is a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talents, and that form of government is the best, which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi into the offices of government. Disenchanted with the direction being taken by the federal government, Jefferson resigned his cabinet position and returned to Monticello. In 1795, he wrote to a French correspondent, reflecting on the times in which they lived, seemingly content in retirement from public affairs. We have chanced to live in an age which will probably be distinguished in history for its experiments in government on a larger scale than has yet taken place, but we shall not live to see the result. From his perspective, the nation's landowners, the whole landed interest, were stalwarts of Republican principles arraigned against the unprincipled, the speculators and holders in the banks and public funds. The voters chose John Adams over Jefferson to succeed George Washington. Both men feared the intrigues of Alexander Hamilton, who maneuvered to be appointed de facto commander of the army. In the meantime, Jefferson raised the issue of whether the states retained the authority to nullify federal law. His thinking is revealed clearly in a letter to Edmund Randolph dated August 18, 1799. Before the Revolution, there existed no such nation as the United States. They then first associated as a nation, but they did not proceed to adopt a whole system of laws ready-made to their hand. As their association as a nation was only for special purposes, to wit, for the management of their concerns with one another and with foreign nations, and the states composing the association chose to give it powers for those purposes and no others, they could not adopt any general system, because it would have embraced objects on which this association had no right to form or declare a will. Jefferson's perspectives found form in the Kentucky Resolves. Madison followed with a somewhat milder document for Virginia. On entering the presidency in 1801, Jefferson made clear to all his commitment to individual rights. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. Leading the nation at this crucial moment demanded much of Jefferson. American merchant ships were boarded and taken by both the British and French navies. The financial stability of the Union remained at risk. Jefferson charged Albert Gallatin, the new Secretary of the Treasury, with bringing things back to that simple and intelligible system on which they should have been organized at first. Yet in 1803, Jefferson had to somehow find $15 million to pay Napoleon Bonaparte for the Louisiana Territory, a purchase doubling the territory of the United States and requiring Jefferson to exercise authority beyond that extended to the executive under the Constitution. One thing the presidency had not changed was Jefferson's faith in an agrarian economy. Writing to the French political economist Jean-Baptiste Say in 1804, he spoke of the immense extent of uncultivated and fertile lands which enables everyone who will labor to marry young and to raise a family of any size. In his mind, the great difference of life for North Americans of European heritage remained the opportunity for almost all to acquire landed property. Jefferson and his fellow Republicans were committed to turning back the clock. As historian Drew McCoy wrote in his study of the period, within the Jeffersonian framework of assumptions and beliefs, three essential conditions were necessary to create and sustain a Republican political economy: a national government free from any taint of corruption, an unobstructed access to an ample supply of open land, and a relatively liberal international commercial order that would offer adequate foreign markets for America's flourishing agricultural surplus. This third provision collapsed under the weight of Jefferson's embargo against British and French commerce. Unemployment skyrocketed and the nation fell into a deep economic depression. Many merchants ignored the embargo and resorted to smuggling. Despite the decline in his own financial fortunes that resulted, Jefferson responded angrily. While honest men were religiously observing it, the unprincipled along our seacoast and our frontiers have been fraudulently evading it. After completion of his second term in the presidency, Jefferson returned to Monticello burdened by heavy personal debts. Yet he continued to accumulate things and to entertain graciously at great cost. To raise needed cash, he eventually sold his own library to the Congress to replace what was burned by the British during the War of 1812. The loss of American shipping and seamen to the British nearly destroyed the new nation's export-dependent economy. Jefferson anticipated that the war would be long and arduous. He believed, "The object of England is to claim the ocean as her domain, and to exact transit duties from every vessel traversing it." Americans responded by becoming producers. To a Scottish correspondent, Jefferson expressed his changed views regarding the nation's means of securing the future. "I have not formerly been an advocate for great manufactories. I doubted whether our labor, employed in agriculture and aided by the spontaneous energies of the earth, would not procure us more than we could make ourselves of other necessaries. But other considerations entering into the question have settled my doubts." The nation was embarking on a new basis for self-sufficiency, one that would bring about a dramatic increase in the production of wealth, but would be accompanied by a dramatic increase in the role of government to establish new and specific rules to guarantee property rights. Laws and regulations would be needed to secure, he wrote, natural and even an hereditary right to inventors. As for one's legitimate claim to property in land, Jefferson asserted that no individual has of natural right a separate property in an acre of land. Rather, land is the property for the moment of him who occupies it, but when he relinquishes the occupation, the property goes with it. What Jefferson believes is that a person should be permitted to own only so much land as is put to productive use. However, as with much that Jefferson proclaimed, there are important contradictions between his ideals and his own actions. Jefferson held slaves to work his land. He also collected ground rents from tenant farmers. On the matter of intellectual property, of property in ideas, Jefferson argued that ideas should freely spread from one another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition, seems to have been peculiarly and benevolently designed by nature. Retired from national and world affairs, Jefferson had time to think even more deeply about the distinction between that which nature provides and that which we produce. He compared the social organization common to the tribes of first Americans and that created on the European model. In 1812 he wrote, "A right of property in movable things is admitted before the establishment of government. A separate property in lands not till after that establishment. The right to movables is acknowledged by all the hordes of Indians surrounding us, yet by no one of them has a separate property in lands been yielded to individuals. He who plants a field keeps possession till he has gathered the produce, after which one has a right as another to occupy it. Government must be established and laws provided before lands can be separately appropriated and their owner protected in his possession. Till then, the property is in the body of the nation, and they, or their chief as trustee, must grant them to individuals and determine the conditions of the grant." His physical health was seriously in decline by 1818, but his mind remained sharp. Responding to a letter from Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse, he asked whether any individual really discovers anything on their own. "The fact is that one new idea leads to another. that to a third, and so on through a course of time until someone with whom no one of these ideas was original combines all together and produces what is justly called a new invention. Toward the end of his life in 1824, he left what is perhaps his most profound thought, asking, "Can one generation bind another, and all others in succession forever?" To which he answered, "I think not. The Creator has made the earth for the living, not the dead. Rights and powers can only belong to persons, not to things, not to mere matter, unendowed with will. A generation may bind itself as long as its majority continues in life. When that has disappeared, another majority is in place, holds all the rights and powers their predecessors once held, and may change their laws and institutions to suit themselves. Nothing then is unchangeable but the inherent and unalienable rights of man." In his final years, his one great project was the design of Virginia's first great public institution of higher learning. Upon his death, on the 4th of July in 1826, his family was faced with demands for the repayment of debts that could not be met. Monticello itself quickly fell into disrepair and was sold in 1831 to a local apothecary. In 1836, it was bought by Uriah Levy, a real estate speculator who was the first Jewish American to serve an entire career as a commissioned Navy officer. He and his nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy, are largely responsible for its restoration and preservation. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, a nonprofit organization, purchased the property in 1923. It is not really possible to conclude the story of Thomas Jefferson. Historians and other scholars continue to discuss and debate his contributions and abilities. His words continue to inspire, even as the details of his personal life reveal his flawed moral sense and controversial treatment of persons of color.